Richard Sterling smirked, adjusting his $50,000 Rolex. Mrs. Hayes, you are a delusional old woman. You have no money, no lawyer, and no family left. Sign the deed to your property, or I'll have the sheriff throw you out on the street by noon. The packed courtroom erupted in cruel laughter. The slick corporate lawyers chuckled, and even the judge banged his gavel while hiding a mocking smile. Martha Hayes, a frail 72-year-old widow, stood entirely alone at the defense table. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. Instead, she gently patted her worn handbag, looked Richard dead in the eye, and spoke into the microphone. I don't need a lawyer, Mr. Sterling. And I am certainly not alone. My boys said they would handle it. Richard threw his head back and laughed loudly. Your boys? Your husband is dead, Martha. Who is going to save you? Before the judge could issue the final ruling, a sound like rolling thunder shook the courthouse walls. The floorboards vibrated. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom suddenly burst open, and the laughter instantly died in the villains' throats. 12 massive men wearing the iconic death's head patches of the Hells Angels walked in, and they weren't smiling. The morning had begun the way every difficult morning begins, quietly and without mercy. Martha Hayes had dressed carefully in her late husband's favorite color, a soft dove gray, pressing the collar of her blouse flat with her arthritic hands. She had made herself a single cup of tea, stood at the kitchen window of the small house attached to the garage, and looked out over the property that Arthur had built with his bare hands over 40 years. The hydraulic lifts, the hand-painted sign, Hayes Auto Cycle Repair, EST 1981. The ancient oak tree in the corner of the lot that Arthur had refused to cut down when they paved the driveway, saying a man who cuts down an oak tree for convenience has already lost something he can never name. She had whispered, I'll do my best, Arthur, and then taken the bus to the courthouse. The courtroom of the Honorable Judge Thomas Vance was already packed by the time she arrived. Sterling's legal team, 4 attorneys from the most expensive firm in the state, had arranged themselves behind their table with the casual confidence of men who had never once lost. Their suits were charcoal and navy, their leather briefcases monogrammed, their expressions already carrying the verdict they expected. Richard Sterling himself sat at the head of their table like a man attending a celebration rather than a trial. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered and surgically tan, the kind of man who believed that wealth was not merely a resource but a moral credential. He had developed 17 luxury commercial districts across 3 states. He had a wing of a children's hospital named after him. He sat on the boards of 2 universities. None of these things had made him a better man. They had simply made him better at being the kind of man he already was. Behind the gallery railing, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters, local business owners who had already sold their properties to Sterling's development company, a few courthouse regulars who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday. They whispered amongst themselves, glancing at the frail old woman who had arrived alone and sat alone and opened a small thermos of tea as though she were waiting for a bus rather than the seizure of her livelihood. Judge Thomas Vance entered, and the room stood. He was a compact, silver-haired man with the posture of someone who had spent decades reminding rooms that he was in charge of them. He had been a respected jurist once, by most accounts. That was before Richard Sterling's development fund had quietly deposited $420,000 into a shell account in the Cayman Islands registered under the judge's wife's maiden name. Now he was simply a man doing arithmetic. The matter before this court, the lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Caldwell, announced, rising to his feet, is the resolution of outstanding debts incurred by the late Arthur Thomas Hayes against Sterling Development, LLC, in the amount of $842,000, collateralized against the property at 1140 Ridgeway Avenue, comprising the dwelling and attached commercial repair facility. Martha raised her hand. Those documents are forged. Caldwell didn't even look at her. Your Honor, the plaintiff requests that the defendant's unsupported verbal assertions be treated as inadmissible disruption. Judge Vance nodded without reading the motion. The record will reflect that the defendant has offered no documentary counter-evidence. Mrs. Hayes, you will speak only when directly addressed. I have the original loan documents in my bag, Martha said pleasantly, reaching for her worn handbag. Mrs. Hayes, the judge's voice hardened. I said when directly addressed. Richard Sterling, who had been scrolling through his phone, set it down and leaned across to whisper something to Caldwell. Caldwell smiled and straightened his tie. What followed was an hour of procedural devastation. Caldwell and his team moved through their arguments with practiced precision, producing documents bearing what they claimed was Arthur Hayes' signature authorizing a business development loan in 2019, 4 years after Arthur Hayes had died of a heart attack while changing the oil on a Harley-Davidson Softail. The forgeries were good. Expensive good. The kind of good that required access to notary records, county filing systems, and the quiet cooperation of at least 2 people inside local government. Martha objected 3 times. 3 times, Judge Vance overruled her with the patient exhaustion of a man running out of clock. The gallery began to murmur with the resigned amusement of people watching something that was technically a fight, but was really just a foregone conclusion being made official. And then Richard Sterling stood up. He hadn't needed to. His lawyers were handling it. But Richard Sterling was the kind of man who could not resist the moment when someone smaller than him was already on the ground. He buttoned his jacket, walked to the front of the room, and looked down at Martha Hayes with something that was almost worse than contempt. It was entertainment. "Martha," he said, dropping the honorific entirely, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "I want you to understand something. I have been patient. I offered you fair market value for this property twice. You could have walked away with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Instead, you chose this." He gestured to the courtroom, to her aloneness, to the thermos on the defense table. "Your husband is gone. Your business has been losing money for 3 years. You have no children, no family, no legal representation. You're standing here alone talking about documents in a handbag." He paused to let the gallery laugh, and they obliged. "Sign the deed today, and I'll let you take your furniture. That's more than the law requires me to offer." Martha looked at him steadily. The laughter settled around her like water parting around a stone. "My husband built that shop with his hands," she said. "He fixed engines for 41 years. He never cheated anyone, never turned anyone away, never charged a man more than the work was worth." She folded her hands on the table. "And I am not alone, Mr. Sterling. My boy said they would handle it." The laughter in the courtroom was louder this time, rolling and contemptuous, the kind of laughter that has cruelty at its center. Richard shook his head and spread his hands in mock bewilderment. "Her boys. Martha, your husband is dead. Who in the world is coming to save you?" And then the windows of the courtroom began to rattle. No one in the gallery understood what the sound was at first. It was felt before it was heard, a deep, rhythmic vibration that moved up through the floor, through the wooden benches, through the soles of feet and the legs of chairs. Then it became a sound, a low, sustained thunder that grew and grew until the overhead lights swayed slightly on their fixtures and the water in Martha's thermos trembled in visible rings. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. Then more. Circling the block, decelerating, their combined engines dropping from a roar to a rumbling idle that still shook the glass. Judge Vance looked up from his papers for the first time all morning with what was unmistakably alarm on his face. Then the oak doors of the courtroom opened. The 2 bailiffs stationed at the entrance stepped backward without deciding to. It was simply what their bodies chose to do when the doors swung wide and the first man walked through. Jackson Cross, Jax to everyone who knew him, and president of the local Hells Angels chapter to everyone who didn't, stood in the doorway for a single moment before moving. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall and built as though several decades of hard labor and harder living had compressed every excess into muscle and forward momentum. His riding jacket was aged black leather, the classic death's head patch of the Hells Angels centered on the back, the chapter bottom rocker reading their home state. His arms were fully sleeved in ink, old pieces and new ones layered over years, a record of a life lived entirely on his own terms. His jaw was heavy, his eyes pale gray and entirely still, the eyes of a man who had stopped being surprised by human behavior a very long time ago. Behind him, 11 more men filed in. They moved with the unhurried coordination of people who had spent years operating as a unit. Not military precision, but something older and more organic than that. The way a pack moves when it has never needed to hurry because it has never needed to fear. They ranged in age from late 30s to early 60s. Some wore their colors with full patches, others wore chapter support gear. All of them were large. All of them were silent. The gallery made no sound at all. One of the bailiffs found his nerve. He stepped forward, hand moving toward his hip. "Sir, this is an active court proceeding. You cannot." Jax turned his gray eyes toward the man, and something in the quality of that look, entirely calm, entirely without aggression, entirely without any concern whatsoever about what the bailiff's hand was doing, froze the officer mid-motion. "We're here for the defendant," Jax said. His voice was low and even and filled the room without effort. "We have every legal right to observe proceedings and provide support to a party in this court. That's settled federal case law. If your department attorney wants to dispute that, tell him to file a motion. We'll wait." The bailiff glanced at Judge Vance. The judge glanced at Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling had gone the particular shade of pale that expensive tans cannot cover. No motion was filed. No further attempt was made to stop them. Richard's personal security team, two large men in dark suits who had been standing against the wall with crossed arms and bored expressions, had straightened at the sound of the motorcycles and were now performing a rapid personal reassessment of the afternoon's likely events. The larger of the two, a former collegiate wrestler who still carried his size, made the mistake of stepping away from the wall and toward the aisle. The man they called Bear materialized between the security guard and the aisle with a speed that seemed physically inconsistent with his size. Bear was the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, and he was built the way load-bearing walls are built, not for appearance, but for the serious management of force. He said absolutely nothing. He simply rolled his neck once, slowly, and the sound it made was like distant knuckles. The security guard sat back down. The 12 Hells Angels filed into the gallery rows directly behind the defense table. They filled 2 full rows. They settled. They became still. Jax walked to the gate in the railing that separated the gallery from the floor of the court. He pushed it open, slowly, with the quiet confidence of a man who had never once in his life asked permission for anything he was entitled to, and walked to the defense table. Martha Hayes watched him come with soft eyes and absolutely no surprise. Jax Cross, the man who had once been described in a local newspaper as one of the most dangerous individuals in the county, lowered himself onto one knee beside the defense table. He took Martha's small hand in both of his, carefully, the way you hold something you know is precious, and looked up at her. "Ma," he said quietly, "we're here." Martha patted his hand twice, the way a mother pats the hand of a grown son she is proud of. "I knew you would be, sweetheart," she said. There was a sound in the gallery. Not laughter this time. Something closer to a collective exhale, as though the room had been holding its breath without knowing it and had just been given permission to breathe. Richard Sterling was staring. His mouth had made the shape of a word but had not managed to produce one. Judge Vance banged his gavel once, twice, and then a third time with slightly more desperation than judicial authority. "Order. This court will have order. Mr." He didn't finish the address, apparently unable to decide how to open a sentence directed at a man wearing a Hells Angels Death's Head patch in his courtroom. Jax rose to his full height and turned to face the bench. "Your Honor," he said, with complete courtesy, "my name is Jackson Cross. I'm here as a character witness and community supporter for the defendant. My associate, Mr. Marcus Thorne, will be representing Mrs. Hayes in today's proceedings." And then the 12th man in the column, who had entered last, who had not been dressed like the others, who had attracted less immediate attention precisely because he was dressed like any other attorney in any other room, reached the gate in the railing, set his briefcase on the defense table, and opened it with 2 crisp clicks. Marcus Thorne was 44 years old, a graduate of Yale Law School, and a partner-level attorney who had argued before federal appellate courts in 4 different circuits. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit of unmistakable quality, a white shirt with precise double-barrel cuffs, and a silver tie knotted with geometric perfection. He moved with the contained authority of a man who had mastered the language of every room he entered, because he had spent years learning that the law, like every other system built by men, was a language, and languages could be used against their architects. When he removed his jacket to hang it over the back of his chair, the collar of his shirt was loose enough to show, at the base of his throat, the bottom edge of a tattoo. Old ink, deeply settled into the skin. The unmistakable curve of the Death's Head. Marcus Thorne had been a Hells Angels prospect at 22. He had earned his patch at 25. He had earned his law degree at 30. He had never left the club, and the club had never asked him to. Caldwell, Sterling's lead attorney, recovered first. He was a professional, and professionals recover. Your Honor, we object to any last-minute addition of counsel. The defendant was given ample opportunity. Mr. Thorne, Judge Vance interrupted, leaning forward with the careful expression of a man who is trying to determine what level of problem has just walked into his courtroom. Are you licensed to practice in this state? Marcus slid a single document across the floor toward the bench without looking up from his briefcase. Bar number and current certification are on the top sheet, Your Honor. I've also included my pro-hack vice admission from the federal district, should today's proceedings require escalation to that level. He finally looked up, and his eyes were calm and absolutely focused. I hope they don't, but I've prepared for both. The gallery was entirely silent. Richard Sterling had turned to Caldwell and was whispering rapidly and without his earlier composure. It was during Marcus's brief procedural exchange with the judge, while Sterling's team was conferring and the bailiffs were trying to remember what the proper protocol was for a situation their training had not covered, that Jack settled into the chair beside Martha, and she told him what she had told no one else. They're going to take it, Jax, she said softly, not looking at him, keeping her voice for him alone. The paperwork is too good. Even with Marcus, it might not be. It won't come to that, Jax said. Just those words. No qualification. Martha looked at him then. Your father would have liked you, she said. I always thought that. Jax said nothing for a moment. Then, Arthur would have liked me to fix that left strut on my bike. I've been putting it off for 2 years. Martha almost smiled. He always said the cobbler's children have the worst shoes. The connection between Jackson Cross and Martha Hayes was not complicated in its origin, though it was profound in its weight. 20 years earlier, Jax had been 26 years old, newly patched, and riding back from a run when his bike threw a chain on the county highway 3 miles from anything useful. He had been on the road for 17 hours. He had one broken rib from a disagreement outside a bar in a town 4 counties over, the kind of disagreement that doesn't get reported to anyone. And he had $63 in his wallet. He had pushed the bike 2 miles to the nearest address. That address had been Hayes Auto Cycle Repair. Arthur Hayes had been closing up for the night. He had seen the young man with the death's head patch and the set jaw and the way he was holding his left side, and he had said one thing. Let me get my tools. He had fixed the bike. He had not asked about the rib. He had charged Jax $40, which was, they both silently understood, significantly less than the work was worth. Martha had appeared from the house attached to the garage with a plate of food and apple pie still warm from the oven, and she had set it in front of this stranger, this young man with his ink and his patch and his reputation, as though he were simply a person who was hungry and in her kitchen, which was exactly what he was. She had asked him 2 questions. Where was he from originally? And was his mother still living? When Jax told her his mother had passed when he was 11, Martha had refilled his coffee without comment, put her hand briefly on his shoulder, and said, Well, you eat up, then. In the years that followed, Jax came back. He brought others. Arthur fixed their bikes, fairly and without judgment, and charged what the work was worth and not a penny more. Martha fed them, bandaged them when they needed bandaging, asked after their families, remembered their birthdays. She never asked about their business. She never needed to. She understood intuitively what most people never did, that the men who moved outside the boundaries of ordinary society were not uniformly monsters, and that the simplest, most radical thing you could do for such a person was to treat them as though they were worth treating well. The chapter had never forgotten. The chapter never would. What Arthur did, Jax had told a younger member once, when he was asked why the chapter maintained such absolute loyalty to an old woman in a small town, wasn't charity. It was respect. There's a difference. Charity is when someone feels sorry for you. Respect is when someone sees you clearly and decides you're worth their time anyway. He had paused. You don't walk away from that. Richard Sterling had rebuilt his composure by the time Marcus Thorne stood to address the court. It was a deliberate and visible reconstruction. The straightening of the jacket, the adjustment of the watch, the reassumption of the particular expression that money and impunity had trained onto his face over decades. He was still the most powerful man in this room. A few bikers in leather didn't change the evidence on the table, and the evidence on the table was what he had paid to make bulletproof. Your Honor, Richard said, not even waiting for Caldwell to speak. This is theater. Whatever these gentlemen have brought in their briefcase, it doesn't change the fact that the debt documentation has already been entered into evidence and certified by 2 independent forensic accountants. He spread his hands. The showman again. The entertainer. I am willing to be generous. Mrs. Hayes, this offer expires when the judge rules. Marcus Thorne set a single sheet of paper on the defense table. He looked at it for a moment as though reading something he had already memorized. Then he closed his briefcase, straightened to his full height, and turned to address the court. Your Honor, the defense moves to introduce People's Exhibit A through Exhibit F into the record. These materials were obtained through a 2-year independent investigation conducted in cooperation with federal oversight. He paused. I will note for the record that several of these exhibits were developed in coordination with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, whose field supervisor is currently in the building. The quality of the silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. Judge Vance's color changed. Not dramatically. He was a man accustomed to controlling himself in public, but enough. Something tightened around his eyes that had not been there a moment ago. Your Honor, Caldwell began, already standing. Any last-minute introduction of so-called federal evidence without prior disclosure is a serious procedural. The disclosure was made, Marcus said without looking at him. He produced a file from his briefcase, opened it, and read the date and certified mail tracking number of a package submitted to the court clerk's office 14 days earlier. The documentation was filed correctly and on time. That it was not brought to Your Honor's attention by the clerk's office is perhaps a matter worth investigating separately. The clerk, a middle-aged woman near the side wall, dropped her pen. Marcus carried Exhibit A to the bench personally. This is a forensic audio recording obtained through lawfully authorized surveillance of a meeting between Mr. Richard Sterling and a Mr. Dale Hofstetter, who is employed as a document certification specialist at the county recorder's office. The recording details, in explicit terms, the creation and backdating of loan documents purportedly signed by Mr. Arthur Hayes. He glanced at Sterling without expression. Mr. Hayes, as the death certificate entered into separate record confirms, died on March 14, 2015. The document Mr. Caldwell entered into evidence this morning is dated November 2019. The meeting in which its creation was arranged took place in January of this year. Richard Sterling stood up. This is fabricated. This is... Mr. Sterling. Judge Vance's voice had the flat, careful quality of a man choosing every word as though each one might detonate. Sit down. Your Honor. Sit down. The courtroom was utterly, profoundly silent. Even the air seemed to hold still. Marcus Thorne moved to Exhibit B. This is a bank record from a financial institution in the Cayman Islands. The account in question, registered under the name Elaine R. Vance, the maiden name of Judge Thomas Vance's wife, received 2 wire transfers from a Sterling Development LLC subsidiary in the amounts of $210,000 and $210,000, respectively. The total received is $420,000. The transfers correspond in timing to the scheduling of this hearing and the appointment of Judge Vance to preside over it. The sound that Judge Thomas Vance made was not quite a word and not quite a breath. It was the small, deflated sound of a man's construction of himself suddenly finding its foundation gone. Marcus did not look at him. He moved to Exhibit C with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who has laid this groundwork carefully and intends to cover every stone. Caldwell was on his feet. Then he sat down. Then he was on his feet again. He turned to Richard Sterling and said something in an urgent undertone. Richard grabbed his arm. Caldwell pulled his arm free, quietly but emphatically, the way a man separates himself from a burning object. He turned to the court. Your Honor, Caldwell said, and his voice had lost every note of its earlier confidence. The law firm of Caldwell, Marsh & Associates wishes to formally withdraw its representation of Mr. Sterling at this time, citing an inability to reconcile the evidentiary record with statements made by our client. Richard Sterling stared at his attorney with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground under his feet is not ground. You can't withdraw, Sterling said. I have a contract. You have a retainer agreement, Caldwell said without looking at him, already gathering his papers. Section 14, Paragraph 3 addresses material misrepresentation by the client. I'll have my office send the formal notice. He clicked his briefcase shut. His two colleagues were already doing the same. Marcus Thorne watched them go with the patient expression of a man who expected exactly this and had built his case on the assumption that it would happen. Then he turned back to the bench. Your Honor, he said, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all claims against Mrs. Martha Hayes, expungement of the fraudulent debt documentation from the county record, and restoration of full and unencumbered title to the property at 1140 Ridgeway Avenue. He paused. Additionally, the defense formally requests that you recuse yourself from issuing any ruling in this matter, given that your impartiality has been materially compromised by the evidence entered into record. In the 2 rows behind the defense table, 12 Hells Angels sat in absolute stillness. They had not moved since they sat down. They had not needed to. Richard Sterling broke. It did not happen slowly. There was no gradual erosion of composure, no dignified retreat to a held position. One moment he was standing behind his empty table, his legal team departed, his evidence demolished, the judge gray-faced and silent in front of him. And the next moment the architecture of the man simply gave way. This is not over, he said. His voice had a quality it had never carried before in this room. Fear wearing the clothes of anger. I have resources you cannot begin to comprehend. I have people in this state at every level of... He stopped. Started again. You think a bunch of bikers and some paperwork scare me? I built this county. I funded half the offices in this building. He turned to his security men. Handle this. Now. The 2 men in dark suits looked at each other. They looked at the 2 rows of Hells Angels. They looked back at Richard Sterling. And then, with a collective and almost synchronized exhale, they did not move. Mr. Sterling, the larger one said quietly, I don't think. I said handle it. What happened next was not violence. It was something considerably more effective than violence. All 12 men in the 2 rows behind the defense table stood up at exactly the same moment. Not rushing, not advancing, not threatening. Simply standing, rising to their full collective height in one motion, like a tide coming in, and then going absolutely still. The security men sat down. They did so without any pretense of making a decision about it. Their bodies simply made the correct calculation and acted accordingly. Richard Sterling looked at the 2 rows of standing men, and something went out of his face entirely. Some light, some furnace of self-belief that had been burning for 54 years was suddenly, completely out. Bear, from the front row, tilted his head slightly to one side, and regarded Sterling with the mild curiosity of a man watching something that doesn't concern him much. Sterling sat down. Marcus Thorne had his phone to his ear before Sterling's chair stopped moving. He spoke quietly and professionally into it, naming the case, the location, the parties involved, and the specific federal statutes that had been violated. He confirmed that the documentation was in hand and that the subjects were present. He gave the estimated time of arrival back to whoever was on the other end of the call as 15 to 20 minutes. Yes, that's correct. And then he put his phone away and stood with his hands folded at the defense table, waiting. Judge Thomas Vance had not spoken in 4 minutes. He sat on his bench in a state that was the judicial equivalent of standing in a field after a lightning strike, alive, upright, but fundamentally altered. He had not risen to leave. He had not issued any ruling. He had simply stopped. Your Honor, Marcus said, with a courtesy that under the circumstances was almost architectural in its precision. Given the circumstances, I believe the appropriate course of action is clear. The motion to dismiss with prejudice stands on the record. I would invite you to issue a formal recusal and refer the matter to the presiding chief judge for assignment. That would be, I think, the most orderly resolution of. Yes. Judge Vance's voice came out very quietly. Yes, motion to dismiss with prejudice is granted. All fraudulent documentation is hereby stricken from the record. Full title to the property described in the case filing is confirmed as belonging to Martha Hayes. He paused. He seemed to be looking at something no one else could see. And I am recusing myself from all further proceedings in this matter, effective immediately. He picked up his gavel, set it down, left the bench. 18 minutes later, 2 federal agents and a representative from the state attorney general's office entered the courtroom through the side entrance. They were not loud about it. They carried documents rather than drawn weapons, and they moved with the confident efficiency of people who have made many arrests and have long since stopped finding it dramatic. Richard Sterling, when the agent approached him, looked up with eyes that had gone entirely flat. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's your right," the agent confirmed, "and that call can be made from the processing center. Please come with us, Mr. Sterling." Richard Sterling stood, buttoned his jacket from pure reflex, and walked out of the courtroom between two federal agents. He did not look at Martha Hayes as he passed the defense table. He almost made it. 3 steps past her, he stopped. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was something more complicated. He turned. Martha was looking at him with an expression that was not triumphant, not satisfied, and not angry. It was something quieter than any of those, a clear-eyed, level recognition. "You made a mistake," she said simply. "You looked at this property, and you saw money. My husband looked at it, and he saw a life." She folded her hands on the table. "You chose to steal from the wrong family, Mr. Sterling. I'm sorry it took this to show you that." Richard Sterling had no answer for this. He walked out. The room was very quiet for a long moment. Then, from the back of the gallery, someone began to applaud. Then someone else. And then the packed courthouse erupted in a sound that was the opposite of the laughter that had filled it an hour before. Martha Hayes put her hands in her lap and closed her eyes briefly. Her lips moved without sound. She was, anyone watching her might have guessed, talking to Arthur. The oak doors opened again, and this time the light came in with them. Jax offered Martha his arm the way a son offers his arm to his mother on a day that matters, not with ceremony, but with the simple physical communication of "I've got you. Lean if you need to." Martha tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow, picked up her worn handbag and her thermos, and walked out of the courtroom at a pace that was entirely her own. The Hells Angels filed out around them in a loose formation, not surrounding her in a way that crowded or rushed, but present, creating a space in which she moved as the center. Marcus Thorne walked at her other side, his jacket back on, his briefcase in hand, the knot of his tie as precise as it had been when he walked in. The corridor of the courthouse was lined with people who had been watching through the glass doors. Courthouse employees, journalists, several of Sterling's lower-level associates who had already begun recalculating their futures. They parted as the group came through. At the main entrance, a court official moved to open the heavy front doors, and the group walked out into afternoon light. The street below the courthouse steps stopped Martha Hayes in her tracks. It stretched for 2 full city blocks in each direction, and it was filled with motorcycles. Not a dozen, not 50. Hundreds of them lined up wheel to wheel along the curb and out into the street, engines ticking as they idled, riders upright on their seats, all of them facing the courthouse. The late afternoon sun caught the chrome along the row and threw light back in long horizontal bands. The chapter had called. The community had answered. Not all of them were full patch members. Some wore support gear and prospect cuts. Some wore no colors at all, mechanics, business owners, veterans, ordinary men and women who had come because word travels fast and because some things demand that you show up in person. But they were there, filling the street with the sound and warmth of engine heat and the particular gravity of people who have gathered for something that matters. When Martha appeared at the top of the courthouse steps, the engines revved. Not deafeningly, not chaotically. It rose in a wave from closest to farthest, a rolling, building sound like applause translated into horsepower, and then settled back to a collective idol that resonated in the chest. Martha stood at the top of the steps and pressed both hands briefly to her heart. Parked at the base of the steps, at the head of the column, was a restored 1967 Cadillac DeVille convertible, black, gleaming, the leather interior a deep burgundy. It belonged to an older member of the chapter who reserved it for occasions that merited it. The top was down. The afternoon light fell across the back seat like a welcome. Jax walked Martha down the steps. Bear walked 4 paces behind, because he always did. Marcus Thorne walked beside them, and when they reached the car, he opened the rear door with a simple, quiet courtesy that had in it nothing of showmanship and everything of genuine regard. Martha paused at the car door. She turned and looked back at the courthouse, at the building where her husband's memory had been attacked and defended and ultimately vindicated. She stood there for a long moment, and something in her expression was complex and complete, grief and gratitude, and the specific satisfaction of someone who has done what they promised to do. Then she turned back, and her eyes moved across the rows of motorcycles and the riders sitting on them, and her voice, when she spoke, was steady. Arthur would have wanted to shake all your hands, she said. Not loudly, but in the way that still reaches everywhere it needs to reach. I'll do my best to stand in for him. Several people in the nearest rows nodded. One older rider, a weathered man with a gray beard, removed his hat. Martha got into the car. Jack swung onto his bike, a Harley-Davidson Road King, black frame, no chrome flash, the death's head and chapter patch centered on the back of his jacket. He rolled to the front of the column. He sat for a moment. Then he raised one hand. 200 engines surged to life. The sound was enormous and clean, and it rolled down the street like a proclamation. People on the sidewalks stopped walking. Some took photographs. Some simply watched, because there are moments that ask to be witnessed, and this was one of them. The column moved. At the center of it, in the gleaming black Cadillac with the top down, Martha Hayes rode with her hands folded in her lap and her chin lifted, watching the town she had lived in for 50 years pass by on either side. The bakery where she bought Arthur's birthday cake every year, the park where she had walked their dog until the dog got old, and then until she walked alone. The library where Arthur had returned books in paper bags because he said books deserved to be kept dry. She looked at all of it, and she held all of it, and she brought it home. The garage at 1140 Ridgeway Avenue was exactly as she had left it that morning. The hand-painted sign was there. The oak tree was there. The hydraulic lifts behind the chain-link fence threw long shadows in the evening light. Jax pulled in first and cut his engine. The column organized itself along the street. Bikes angled neatly to the curb with the practiced ease of people who have done this 100 times. The Cadillac pulled into the driveway, and when the door opened, Jax was there to offer his hand. Martha stood in her driveway and looked up at the sign. Hayes Auto Cycle Repair, EST 1981. It needs a paint touch-up on the H, she observed. I'll get someone on it, Jax said. You'll do it yourself, she said, walking toward the house door. Your lettering was always better than the other boys. She stopped at the door and looked back at the crowd filling her street. The engine's quiet now, the riders standing or sitting, the long evening light falling over all of them. I'm going to put the kettle on, she called out. I don't have cups for everyone, so you'll have to share. There was laughter. Genuine, warm, unforced laughter that had nothing cruel in it at all. Marcus Thorne sat on the hood of the Cadillac and loosened his tie. The tattoo at the base of his throat was visible in the low light. He looked at the garage sign for a moment, then opened his briefcase and produced a bottle of very good bourbon, which he passed to Bear without comment. Bear looked at the bottle. He looked at Marcus. He nodded once with the slow gravity of a man granting a significant approval. Jack stood at the edge of the driveway and looked at the street full of people and bikes and the last angle of afternoon light on chrome. And he thought about a night 20 years ago when a man named Arthur Hayes had said, "Let me get my tools," to a young man who had expected nothing, who had learned, by 26, to expect nothing, and had given him instead a fixed chain and a warm meal and a refilled cup of coffee and the particular, radical, world-altering gift of being treated as someone, worth someone's time. He thought about what a thing like that costs to give and what it is worth to receive. He thought about the weight of a debt that is not a burden but a privilege, because it means someone taught you what it looks like when a person is genuinely good. He thought about Arthur Hayes, who was gone now, and about Martha Hayes, who was inside making tea for 200 people with a face as calm and steady as a river. The street was full. The house was lit. The sign was standing. Some things are worth exactly what they cost to protect. Jax walked inside.